Most weeks, I try not to talk about MMA or MMA-related topics any more than once per podcast. But sometimes circumstances present themselves where it becomes kind of necessary. And something did actually come up this week. Now, I was perusing my Twitter, and I happened to notice that somebody seemed like they were going through a little bit of a hard time. I'm not going to say who that person was, but they'll know who they are when they see this. Nobody else really needs to. I don't think anybody else really needs to know who this person who was going through the hard time was. But to kind of paraphrase it, what this person was basically saying was that they were having a really hard time with their mental state of late, and they just kind of felt like no matter what they did, everything that they were doing was screwed up. And I really did feel that, because of the last couple of weeks in particular, I've actually felt like that pretty often. There is a bit of a situation going on for myself, and maybe at some point I'll actually talk about it on the podcast, but this isn't really today. But what I'm going to talk about today was something that I thought would really help this other individual, and also other people who kind of feel like just everything they're putting their hands on right now turns to shit, and everything in their life is all screwed up. And what that has to do with in particular is a recent episode of the Jocko Willink podcast. Now, people who have been listening to 100 Degrees, since the beginning, by now should be very familiar with Jocko Willink. As a matter of fact, it was the Jocko Willink podcast that the General Bruce Clark that I keep talking about, that particular speech, that's exactly where that was originally sourced from, for my purposes. And so it's a podcast I think very highly of, and I think that it does wonders for a lot of people, and actually including myself. And so this particular episode of the podcast that I'm talking about was one that had come out about 2 weeks ago. And in this podcast, Jocko was interviewing the legendary Rickson Gracie, arguably perhaps one of the greatest Jiu Jitsu practitioners of all time, maybe the best. I think for a lot of people it's probably pretty close to a toss-up between Royce or Rickson. I mean, Royce is the one that everybody knows because he was the guy that came out and won UFC 1 by basically just out-grappling a lot of guys that were bigger than him, people thought that they shouldn't be able to do it. Now, there were two things in particular in this podcast that really stuck out to me, and they stuck out to me so much. I mean, they were just, these two things that he talked about, they are literally, the idea of them is just so beautiful that the first time that I heard them, I'm not going to lie to you, I'm not too proud to admit that I actually cried a little bit, just from the sheer beauty of it. And so the first thing that he had talked about was he talked about being a teenager, and his father was the legendary Rickson Gracie was driving him to one of his earliest jiu-jitsu matches that he ever had. And he said to his son, if you win, I will give you a gift. But if you lose, I will give you 2 gifts. And he goes on to say that he doesn't remember if he ever actually got 2 gifts when he lost that fight, because apparently he did. But thinking about it from an outsider's perspective, like a outsider's perspective, I actually think that his dad did indeed give him 2 gifts, just in telling him that. And so I think basically what he was really trying to say was that if you win, I'm going to love you. But if you lose, I'm still going to love you. And you will know that I will love you even when you lose. Even when you don't succeed at a particular thing, even when you fail at a particular thing, He knew at that point that his father's love was unconditional. And so at that particular stage of his life, and really as anybody goes through life, there's something very empowering in that knowledge, in the sense that, at that point, to know that the people that love you unconditionally, and they love you regardless of whether or not they consider you to have succeeded or failed. It's very in tune with some of the most basic philosophies associated with martial arts. In particular, the one that tells us that really, pain is temporary and life is cyclical. So unless you let it live in your heart and in your mind, when something hurts you, it only hurts you once, as long as you move on afterwards. As long as you don't dwell and live in that pain and let it rule you for the rest of your life. The pain of failure, you feel it once. But the things that you learn from that, the things that you learn from pain, the things that you learn from failure, the wisdom that you accrue, that stays with you and can serve you throughout the rest of your life. And so basically what Rickson Gracie had told Rickson on that particular day is that it is okay to fail and it is okay to lose, as long as you learn something from the experience. And so that was the first very beautiful thought that came out of that podcast. And the second one was, in all honesty, I thought it was a little bit more beautiful still. And so he was talking about his very first professional fight. So in his very first professional fight at 19 years of age, he was fighting this legendary fighter. This guy had won he had fought something like 160 fights. He had 140 wins, 20 draws. This guy had never lost in a very long professional fighting career. And this was the guy that Rickson had drawn for his first fight. And so in between rounds at a particular point, he was basically ready to throw in the towel. He had drawn the conclusion that he wasn't going to be able to win that fight. And he went back to his corner and he said to his father, we have to throw in the towel. I'm not going to win this fight. I can't go on. I'm too badly hurt. And his dad said to him, no, you get back in there and you keep fighting, because you're going to win this thing. And what he said was that he went back into that fight and he won that in the very next round. He got on this guy's back, slapped a rear naked choke on him, and the guy couldn't escape and he tapped out. And so not only did he win his very first professional fight, after he was so certain that he wasn't even going to be able to continue, let alone win the fight, but he won it against a guy who had literally never lost. And what he said was that in that particular fight, at that particular time, in between those two rounds, he couldn't actually trust his own mind. His own mind was telling him, you have to quit, you have to give up, you can't win this. And his mind was telling him things that, based on the result, we can tell now obviously were not true. And so his mind were telling him things that were making him weak. And there's a lot of different things that actually fold into this idea. There's a lot of Jordan Peterson that you can fold into this idea. That's one thing that Jordan Peterson tells us. He says that don't say things that make you weak. And when you lie to yourself about your abilities and you doubt your own abilities, you do make yourself weak. Now that can go the other way. Chael Sonnen tells us that sometimes fighters have to lie to themselves and that they can't accept their limits and they can't accept their weaknesses. And I think that's a terrible idea, because when you lie to yourself about your abilities and you make yourself too confident, well, then you've still told yourself something that makes you weak. But here's the ultimate point of it, is that regardless of whether or not what you put into your mind makes you strong and makes you confident, or if it makes you weak and makes you unconfident, we have the choice as we go through our lives. We get to decide what we put into our minds. We don't necessarily get to decide what other people try to put into our minds, but we do get to make the decision as to whether or not we're going to allow people to put positive things into our minds or negative things into our minds. And Chael Sonnen did say another thing recently that I thought was just just so extremely wise. He basically said, never take criticism from somebody that you wouldn't ask for advice. Now, I'm not going to suggest that it's necessarily easy, to know your true capabilities, and it's not necessarily easy to know your true limits. But as long as you discover these things and learn them, that's really the only way that you can learn to trust your own mind. Now, once again, I'm not going to name any names in terms of the person that this portion of the podcast is intended for. But what I will tell them, and they're going to know who I'm speaking to, is that when your mind is telling you that all you ever do is screw up, the simple fact of the matter is that you know better than that. And in that particular moment, your mind is telling you something that's trying to make you weak. When your mind is telling you that, that's the time when you can't trust your mind. So you need to keep reminding yourself of all of the things that make you a strong person, that make you confident. And those are the things that your mind will tell you that you can actually trust. I think if that's good enough for Rickson Gracie, that is good enough for absolutely anybody.